All right, let's unpack this. We are tackling a deeply nuanced and often anxiety-inducing topic today. We're talking about conflict media.
So think lightsabers, superhero films, action cartoons.
The entire Star Wars universe, really. And we're looking at its impact on a very specific and, I think, vulnerable group.
Right. Neurodivergent boys aged about 5 to 7.
Typically those diagnosed with ASD or, ADHD.
And it's such a vital deep dive because the typical response we see when parents bring this up is, well, it's often driven by fear.
100%. The knee-jerk reaction for so many parents is this kind of moral panic.
Or just banning the media outright. Just this belief that any representation of conflict is going to automatically lead to real aggression.
And the data, it suggests that reaction it's missing at least half the story. Our mission here, and we're pulling from developmental psychology, media effects research, and, crucially, the voices of the neurodivergent community itself.
Which is so important.
It is. Our mission is to deliver balanced, evidence-based guidance. We're looking for an actionable, nuanced understanding that moves past those, blanket recommendations.
The real question is, when should a parent lean in and maybe even encourage this play? And when is it genuinely a cause for concern?
Exactly.
I think the core challenge for parents is really learning how to differentiate, to see the line between healthy, adaptive, aggressive play.
Which is actually beneficial.
Which is actually beneficial, yeah. And on the other side, harmful aggression, which is a genuine risk.
And for neurodivergent kids in particular, this strong interest in these, high-intensity narratives, it often ties directly into a critical need, right?
It does. It's a need for sensory, emotional, and social cognitive processing tools. We have to understand the underlying function this play serves for them.
Okay.
So to start, we really have to establish that crucial baseline. Why does conflict play even exist for children in this age range, regardless of their neurotype?
Right. Let's start with the physical and social reality of, young boys' lives. And that's often defined by rough-and-tumble play, or R&T.
All right.
And this isn't just a human thing. R&T is universally common. It's actually the most common form of play conduct observed among primates throughout history.
So we're hardwired for this.
It seems so. We're talking about chasing, wrestling, play fighting. But the key is that it's fundamentally enjoyable, good-humored, and nonviolent by its very nature.
That distinction, enjoyable, good-humored, nonviolent, is absolutely crucial to get right from the start.
Why is it so crucial?
Because R&T is adaptive behavior. It's not a malfunction. It's physically and socially stimulating. It helps children learn boundaries, social cues. It even helps them regulate their own arousal levels.
So it's practice.
It's practice. If you watch them closely, they use what we call a play face. They alternate roles so the chaser becomes the chased.
Ah, so there's reciprocity.
There's reciprocity. And they instantly stop if one of them shows real distress. It teaches them to read signals, which is a critical high-bandwidth social skill.
So the act of pretending to fight is actually this highly structured social practice. And pretend play, generally, is where the real developmental heavy lifting happens.
Precisely. Pretend play is, at its heart, a metaphorical activity. It's the space where children can detach the real-world significance from materials or immediate circumstances.
And that freedom is the point.
That freedom is everything. It's what allows them to work through these deeply meaningful experiences and master intense feelings like anxiety or fear or inadequacy. They're creating a psychological safety zone.
We see this so clearly in some of the specific case studies from the source material. You might have a child who's really struggling with the increasing academic demands at school.
Right. Those feelings of inadequacy, that turbulence starts creeping in around age 6 or 7.
And so that child might repetitively reenact a story like Peter Pan, where the hero always defeats the enemy and overcomes great peril.
And that repetition is the key mechanism. That play provides a world they can fully control. A world where they can work through those underlying emotional challenges in a safe way.
So the constant theme of overcoming lets them practice mastery in a low-stakes environment.
Yes, it's self-soothing, and it's developmentally therapeutic.
What's fascinating here is how these intense narrative themes manifest specifically in the play of boys aged 5 to 7. Their stories, they commonly revolve around power relations, disagreement, aggressive play behavior, issuing commands.
Well, this age group is deeply exploring hierarchy and social structure.
Okay.
The characters they invent or select, dragons, beasts, superheroes, or the bad guys who behold all this mighty power, They're all tools for this exploration.
Tools for what, exactly?
They're often trying out disobedient acts or forms of conflict, not because they're inherently bad, but as a way to explore and gain power and status within a really complex peer group structure.
Yeah.
They're testing the limits of authority and control.
Which is essential for their social cognitive growth.
It is.
But that exploration immediately brings up that parental worry, doesn't it? Are they practicing aggression or are they practicing boundary setting? How do we know they get the difference when they're shouting commands?
The research suggests that older preschool children, and that includes our target age range of 5 to 7, can reliably distinguish between pretend and real aggression.
So they get it. They know the difference.
They know the difference between a playful wrestling match and a real punch. They have the cognitive capacity to separate the frame of pretense from the frame of reality.
But I sense a but coming.
However, and this is a critical caveat that we have to carry through the rest of this discussion, for some children, those boundaries between pretend and real aggression are more difficult to decipher, or they might be inconsistently applied.
And this might be especially relevant when we apply the neurodivergent lens later on.
Exactly, when processing nuances can be a real challenge.
This ability to distinguish, it starts early, with what we can call the symbolic ladder of emotional development. Around age 3, kids start combining abstract ideas to tell, coherent stories. They're moving toward logical thinking and a better understanding of what's real and what isn't.
And that capacity evolves so rapidly across early childhood and into middle childhood. As their emotional and mental abilities mature, they're moving toward truly abstract thinking.
Yeah, and what does that allow them to do?
It allows them to fully distinguish reality from fantasy, self from non-self, and even one feeling from another. So when a child pretends to be a hero, defeating an enemy to bring justice, or steps into future roles like a police officer or a parent,
They're running developmental simulations.
that's a great way to put it. They're expanding their narratives using theory of mind and empathy.
And conflict is a huge part of those simulations. We often worry as parents when a child identifies too closely with the villain, Darth Vader, the Joker.
Yes.
But there's a profound psychological function there as well, one that adults often miss.
We have to be so careful not to confuse symbolic play with real intent. In some cases, a child might actively identify with the sheer power of the bad guy or the aggressor.
Why would they do that?
This identification can be a counterphobic attempt,
Counterphobic.
meaning they assume the aggressor's power as a shield to avoid being afraid of it. Or they use the role to try and understand the villain's motives.
So if we go back to that idea of the child who's struggling with anxiety, say, about starting kindergarten or being left alone, that feeling of powerlessness must be immense.
Exactly. So holding on to this magical thinking where he could be successful and even excited by danger, that helps him modulate those really intense, turbulent emotions.
So when a kid is playing Darth Vader,
They're probably not trying to conquer the galaxy. They might just be trying to conquer the anxiety they feel about being small and inadequate in a very big world.
they're experimenting with power and fear.
Safely, within the space of pretense. They're using the sheer size and control of the villain as a necessary psychological tool.
That completely reframes the purpose of the play. It's an emotional strategy, not an aggression rehearsal.
Precisely. Okay, so now we introduce the variable that significantly increases the stakes.
Yeah.
Media.
Right. Specifically the content and the format of television and animation.
And we have to be clear, there are correlational findings that researchers just cannot ignore, particularly when we look at the sheer volume.
The volume is startling. I saw one figure. A child watching an average of 2 hours of cartoons a day will have seen 10,000 violent acts in a single year.
It's an incredible amount of exposure. And the sources point out that contemporary animated shows have often elevated the levels of violence and graphic content compared to earlier decades.
So this leads to correlational data suggesting a link.
It does. Some researchers believe that high levels of violence in cartoons can make children more aggressive. And we have studies like those conducted among Taiwanese children that have shown watching more cartoon violence is statistically associated with higher levels of aggression.
But the relationship isn't simply A causes B.
No, it's not that simple.
The devil is in the details. Specifically, whether that violence is presented as comedic or as serious.
And the research draws a very clean, very critical line here. Laboratory experiments using cartoons that feature comedic violence.
Like slapstick, Wile E. Coyote falling off a cliff.
Exactly, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Those studies have consistently failed to demonstrate significant differences in reality-oriented aggression among the viewers.
Why is that?
Because the comedic context provides that cognitive distance we talked about earlier. It signals this is not real.
Okay.
But in stark contrast, field experiments have consistently shown that aggressive behavior toward peers increases following the viewing of non-comedic violent cartoons.
So the cartoon coyote doesn't make them aggressive, but maybe a gritty superhero taking a life in a serious context. That might.
The difference is the perceived reality and the context.
Yeah.
And the mechanism is imitation.
Young children tend to mimic what they see.
They mimic negative behavior, especially when they lack the moral context to process it. The probability that a child will replicate these behaviors is enhanced when the characters are powerful, eye-catching, and, easy to relate to as uncriticized role models.
So if the character is glamorous and effective, the behavior becomes glamorous and effective too.
That's the risk.
What about superhero content specifically? Because this is really the core of the parental concern, the capes and the lightsabers that dominate our entertainment landscape.
Superhero culture presents a very complex ethical and behavioral picture. There is research that suggests engaging with certain types of superhero media can magnify aggressive behaviors.
Not just play, but actual hitting, pushing.
Right, actual hitting, pushing, and name-calling, rather than defensive or pro-social ones. And this is linked to the moral narrative.
How so?
A common theme that emerges in these shows is that official authorities, like the police, are often portrayed as ineffective.
Right, they're useless, so the hero has to step in.
And the hero has to take justice into their own vigilante hands.
That's a huge moral lesson for a 5-year-old brain to process. It's moving beyond simple physical action and toward a kind of skewed moral reasoning.
It raises a legitimate concern that children, particularly those in what we call the pre-operational stage, who are still solidifying their grasp on authority and reality.
They might see this vigilante theme as real-world advice.
That when injustice happens, they should immediately bypass adults and exert their own physical power. The narrative framing matters tremendously.
Okay, so if the violence content is one critical risk, the format, the pacing of the visual and auditory stimuli is arguably the second.
And potentially the most critical risk factor, regardless of neurotype, but especially relevant for the kids we're talking about today.
So we need to pivot now to executive function, or EF.
EF is the absolute core of self-regulation. We sometimes call it the traffic control system of the mind.
I like that.
Because it governs these crucial skills like attention, inhibitory control.
The ability to stop yourself from doing something?
Exactly. And planning. These are the fundamental building blocks of behavioral and emotional maturity.
And the data on fast-paced media's immediate impact on EF is, well, it's pretty significant.
It is. A study found a significant main effect based on the intervention type. Young children who were exposed to fast-paced television did significantly worse on composite EF scores compared to a control group.
And what was the control group doing?
A quiet activity like drawing.
And how do they measure this?
They use tasks that demand high levels of self-control and planning. Things like the Tower of Hanoi puzzle, the backward digit span test, and the classic delay of gratification tasks.
The marshmallow test.
That's the one. And when they're exposed to rapid, discontinuous, high-stimulus media, the system appears to get immediately taxed, and their performance degrades.
So just watching a lot of TV in general during preschool years is a risk factor.
It's recognized as a risk factor for developmental problems, potentially because of these detrimental effects specifically on working memory and inhibitory control.
It sounds like the rapid-fire stimuli don't allow the brain to practice the self-management skills it needs.
Precisely. The brain, especially a developing brain, needs pauses. It needs predictability. It needs time to process and integrate information. Fast-paced media violates that expectation.
And the context of the exposure matters, too. It's not just about focused viewing.
No, absolutely not.
So even background noise is a problem.
It's a huge problem. The detrimental effects on EF are not limited only to active watching time. One study determined that children's focused attention span was still being captured 3/4 of the time the television was simply turned on in the background.
Wow.
It indicates that television is far more than just background noise. It's an omnipresent, rapidly changing and demanding stimulus that can chronically overload the brain's processing capacity.
And that could lead to long-term attentional and developmental problems.
That's the concern.
Okay, this is where we need to apply that EF and sensory knowledge directly to our specific audience, because a fast pacing impacts typically developing kids.
Then we have to spend serious time thinking about the multiplicative effect on a child whose regulatory and attentional systems are already prone to malfunction.
Let's start with sensory overload and dysregulation in ASD.
For youth with autism spectrum disorders, sensory overresponsivity, or SOR, is extremely common. More than half experience it.
And SR is what exactly?
It's defined as an extreme negative or sometimes even painful reaction to sensory stimuli. It can manifest as hypersensitivity to sounds, lights, intense visual detail, or certain textures.
So for this group, the visual and auditory assault of an intense action scene, the sudden cuts, the loud explosions, the high-frequency sounds.
It could be physically painful or deeply disturbing in a way that neurotypical peers just cannot fathom.
That's the most critical distinction, isn't it?
It is, and the neurobiological basis suggests that SOR may be caused by deficits in regulating emotional reactions to stimuli. Studies have identified differences in neural habituation in the sensory cortices and in the amygdala.
The brain's primary emotion and threat center. Can you unpack the neurobiology for us for a moment? What does that mean in practical terms?
Sure. Think of it this way. There's evidence of disrupted functional connectivity between the amygdala, which is like the alarm, and the orbital frontal cortex, or OFC.
And the OFC is?
The OFC is the brain's emotional evaluation and regulation center. It's the part that says, okay, that's just a loud sound, it's not a real threat.
So there's a disconnect.
There's a disconnect. An analogy we can use is that the amygdala is the volume knob for all your sensory input. The OFC is the sound system that determines if the input is too loud or just right. For a child experiencing SOR, the volume knob has lost its connection to the sound system.
So the sound comes in hot and the regulatory system can't quickly turn it down or filter it out.
Exactly. The emotional signal comes in super hot, and the regulatory part of the brain has trouble connecting to or taming that response, and that leads directly to dysregulation.
Which brings us back to media.
It does. The risk of media intensity becomes crystal clear. For a neurodivergent child aged 5 to 7, the increased intensity and frequency of violence and graphic content in contemporary animated shows.
Especially that fast-paced, high-coherence digital media.
It carries a significant risk.
Yep.
It can easily become a dysregulating sensory experience that triggers SOR, leading to agitation, meltdowns, or extreme withdrawal.
So the goal of using media for regulation is instantly reversed. It becomes a source of sensory chaos.
That's the danger.
Now, shifting to ADHD and the ADHD experience, we often focus on inattention, but hyperfocus is the other side of that coin.
And perhaps even more relevant to problematic media use.
How so?
Hyperfocus is defined as excessive attentional dysfunction. It's a failure to shift attention away from an engaging task. This contrasts sharply with inattention, which is a deficient dysfunction, a failure to sustain attention.
But both are malfunction of attentional control.
Exactly. And the concern here is profound. Hyperfocus symptoms have been found to be significantly associated with internet addiction tendencies, particularly in the inattentive types of ADHD.
That's a powerful and, frankly, worrying connection. The media attraction becomes a dependency or an addictive behavior.
It can. Hyperfocus was found to partially mediate the relationship between internet addiction and ADHD.
Which means?
It means the strong tendency to focus excessively plays a key role in developing problematic media use. Using digital content to the extent that one neglects themselves or those around them, which is a core symptom listed in hyperfocus assessments.
Why is digital content so uniquely susceptible to triggering hyperfocus? Why not a book or a Lego set?
It really comes down to the statistical structure of the digital signal itself.
The signal.
Yeah. The general effects of fast-paced media on executive function are amplified because the content itself is statistically structured to be highly engaging. Digital data is characterized by enhanced coherence and discontinuity.
You could think of it as junk food for the brain.
That's a perfect analogy. It hits the reward system instantly and powerfully. It violates the brain's hardwired expectation of a slower, more neutrally structured informational diet that we find in the physical world.
So the content is basically engineered to be instantly gratifying and hard to look away from, and that bypasses the already malfunctioning attentional control system in ADHD.
Precisely. This statistical alteration can reverse the natively stable homeostatic feedback loop in the brain into an unstable positive feedback loop.
Where pursuing short-term appetites makes long-term needs worse.
Yes, a mechanism very similar to impulse control disorder and addiction. It's the statistically structured lure of the digital signal overwhelming an already vulnerable control system.
And you mentioned story comprehension, too.
Right. There's specific research focusing on story comprehension deficits in boys with ADHD when they're watching televised stories. This emphasizes that passive viewing may not allow for effective learning or processing of moral consequences for this particular group.
Okay, we also have to address a really painful and pervasive misconception regarding autistic individuals and their relationship with fiction. The idea that they fundamentally mix up reality and fantasy is so prevalent.
To the extent that some autistic adults describe hearing this assumption as a form of gaslighting.
And the evidence,
Yeah.
it just doesn't support that idea.
No. The evidence and the consensus from the community is clear. Autistic individuals generally know the difference between what is real and what is not. They are often highly logical thinkers.
So where does the complexity come in?
It arises not from a failure to understand the concept of reality, but in the processing and reconciliation. They may struggle to contextualize or navigate a situation that bridges the two if they've never encountered that specific scenario before.
Can you give us a tangible example of that gap?
Sure. Think about social expectations. A neurotypical child might understand the social nuances of a fictional confrontation and know exactly how that translates into a schoolyard argument.
They can generalize it?
They can generalize it. An autistic child, who might have superior pattern recognition but less access to intuitive social scripts, knows the fictional world is fake. But when a real-world conflict arises, they struggle to generate the appropriate, socially acceptable response, precisely because they lack the experiential anchor.
So the fantasy gives them a script.
But the reality often requires rapid, non-literal interpretation that they haven't practiced.
So it's not a failure of understanding the basic concept of reality. It's a failure of having the experiential knowledge to smoothly contextualize the fantasy or adapt the script.
Yes. And we see this with symbolic play and inconsistency. Take the example of Benny, age 10, who's still engaging in this intense superhero play.
Okay.
He understands reality. But his grasp may become inconsistent or fracture when his comprehension or his self-regulation fails him. His symbolic pretense provides that necessary respite to fight back against anxiety or inadequacy.
Even if he sometimes needs to be rescued by a superhero in his own narrative.
Right. The play is an emotional working out mechanism. And we shouldn't pathologize the moments when the boundary between pretense and emotional need becomes momentarily fluid.
Okay, so if the risks are centered on this sensory overload and problematic attentional patterns, we need to focus seriously on where the massive benefits lie.
Absolutely.
Because our sources indicate that for this group, these intense conflict narratives, especially those based on moral clarity, like Star Wars, can be profound developmental tools.
And what's fascinating here is how the Star Wars universe specifically resonates and acts as a social bridge.
A social bridge.
Yes. For many autistic individuals, this franchise offers a galaxy where being fundamentally different is celebrated. It's often synonymous with power.
For sensitive characters, often outsiders or orphans like Luke Skywalker and Rey.
They're powerful because they perceive the world differently. The narrative validates their difference.
So it's not just the story, it's an affirmation.
Absolutely. The lore provides structure, clear moral lines, the light side and the dark side, and a sense of belonging to an ordered, if challenging, universe.
There's an anecdote in the source material.
Yes. One fan expressed that their autism made them feel like they lived in a galaxy far, far away, just like the different Star Wars characters. It's an identity script that affirms their unique perspective.
And this turns what might be an isolating special interest into a powerful social tool.
Exactly. Star Wars serves as a great social tool. It bridges gaps, it facilitates friendships, it fosters shared interests and language. It provides a relatable common ground for social interactions where they already possess expert knowledge.
So that deep connection, or hyperfocus on the topic, might actually be a way of searching for familiar narratives.
Or representations that affirm the neurodivergent identity and help them structure social interactions around predictable shared knowledge.
And that joy isn't confined to passive viewing. We see a powerful crossover into offline creative life.
That's right. The interest and joy found in online activities, whether it's building a community on Discord or engaging in creative world-building play within games like Minecraft or Roblox, it often translates directly to productive offline expressions.
So parents should recognize that value.
Yes, because it can inspire them to create art or engage in imaginative role-playing or read complex nonfiction inspired by their fictional interests. The engagement with the narrative fuels constructive activity.
Okay, so we established that executive function is a primary vulnerability, but hero play can actually be a critical intervention to strengthen EF.
Right. Let's talk about the astonishing results of what's been called the Batman effect.
The Batman effect. I love it.
It demonstrates that adopting a character persona is crucial for developing self-regulatory skills. A study examined 4 to 6-year-old children invited to pretend they were a strong-minded hero like Batman.
And what happened?
Those children persevered on a tedious computer task significantly longer. They lasted about 46% of the time. Compared to children who were asked to think about themselves in the first person, they only lasted 29% of the time.
That is nearly a 20-point jump in persistence on a boring task simply by changing the perspective.
It's an incredible result.
So how does this heroic self-talk achieve this kind of cognitive scaffolding?
It creates what we call psychological distance.
Psychological distance.
By pretending, children gain crucial distance from their own immediate overwhelming impulses and feelings of, boredom or frustration. They shift their internal monologue from, I hate this, I want to quit, to what would Batman do right now?
So they step outside their emotional state.
And they utilize the hero's persona to exercise greater control over their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The very definition of practicing inhibitory control and persistence, which are critical EF skills often underdeveloped in ADHD and ADHD.
And this taps into the concept of effective bravery. They're borrowing the hero's courage.
Exactly. Children identify with the bravery and unflappability of the hero. There's this moving example of one child who said that when he is Batman, he doesn't feel afraid of the dark as much because, and I'm quoting, Batman isn't afraid, bats live in the dark.
Wow.
This symbolic adoption of the hero's persona enables them to modulate their real-world anxiety and persist in tasks that would otherwise trigger their avoidance response.
We also know that children with ASD tend to be visual learners. They often display superior visual processing skills, but poorer verbal understanding.
Which naturally makes visual media a powerful, structured intervention tool that can leverage their strengths.
How does that work in practice?
Well, visual strategies are evidence-based practices for this population. Video modeling, or VM, is a particularly effective visual strategy. It involves the child watching short, filmed clips of a model.
Who could be anyone?
It could be the child themselves or someone else, completing a targeted social or play behavior. And then you provide the opportunity for the child to replicate it.
And how does that compare to the traditional live modeling that therapists or parents might use?
One published study compared VM to in vivo, or live, modeling, and found that video modeling led to faster acquisition of play, language, and self-help skills.
And greater generalization of those skills.
Yes. VM is often more effective because it minimizes the high cognitive load associated with attention and complex language requirements. It offers a clear, predictable, repeatable script. It's often more motivating for children with autism, and it minimizes common issues like stimulus over selectivity.
So if a parent wants their child to learn how to initiate a group game, filming a short clip of a hero or an action figure initiating that game can teach social fluency more effectively than a verbal instruction.
Absolutely. And we also see this concept applied to social scripts. Simple conversational scripts are an evidence-based practice for teaching social initiations and sustained conversations for children with ASD.
And these scripts work best when they're associated with an environmental stimulus.
Right, like a specific Star Wars toy or an activity setting. This structured visual approach helps them overcome difficulties in initiating social contact, or what is sometimes called social freezing.
It anchors the conversation.
Correct. The complexity can vary, but the critical part is that the lines follow each other logically to maintain that to and fro nature of dialogue, which eases the anxiety of conversational unpredictability. The media provides the safe, predictable anchor for the interaction.
Okay, let's get practical. This is about finding the balance and scaffolding. We've established the developmental reality that combat play fighting has a positive relationship with social affiliation, especially among male preschool children.
Right.
The themes of power, pro-social behavior, and the moral domain addressed in superhero play, they often signify constructive lessons. In one study, the themes addressed least in superhero play narratives were rough-and-tumble, weapons play, and aggression.
Which suggests that for those children, the play was highly narrative-driven and not inherently harmful.
So this brings us back to distinguishing between expression, healthy emotional processing, and reinforcement, which is harmful behavioral replication.
Right. The play itself is often an expression of emotional mastery or a practice of moral concepts. The risks arise when children simply imitate the character's aggressive actions
Especially that non-comedic violence.
without having the opportunity to process the moral clarity or the consequences.
So the danger isn't the lightsaber per se, it's when the child uses the lightsaber to express genuine anger or non-reciprocal aggression.
Or when the parent hasn't talked through the consequences of its use. That's the core insight. Parents have an essential role in persuading and scaffolding their children's conceptual foundations of moral and social ideas of violence and conflict resolution.
So how do you tell the difference?
Look for the play face. Listen for the tone. Check for reciprocity. Is the other child enjoying it too? If the play is truly voluntary and reciprocal, it is likely expression. If it's forced, non-reciprocal, or causes distress, that's a reinforcement issue that needs immediate intervention.
Which leads directly into practical strategies, starting with the scaffolding inherent in co-viewing.
Right. And this isn't just about sitting on the couch together. It's about active engagement.
This is the essential guide phase.
It is. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and others recommend that parents watch media with their children and actively discuss the content. This allows parents to provide context, moral clarity, and point out the consequences of a character's actions in real time.
For example,
Explicitly pointing out when a hero shows compassion or discussing why the villain made a bad choice.
and the scaffolding extends to the play itself.
Absolutely. Scaffolding play means facilitating structured conflict, designating safe areas for R&T, using soft, safe objects like water noodles for fencing or practice lightsabers,
And explicitly discussing safety rules.
and social signals like timeout or stop.
Mhm.
This creates a safe structure for their intense engagement.
We also have to acknowledge the unique sensory and regulatory needs of neurodivergent children in setting digital boundaries.
Yes, particularly around the high sensory curator.
Explain that term.
This is critical to parental understanding. Research indicates that neurodivergent children who are high sensory curators, those who need to carefully manage and select their sensory input, experience conflict around digital media, use up to 4 times more frequently than typically developing children.
And why is that?
Because media often functions as a necessary sensory curation tool for them.
Meaning it helps them cope with a difficult environment.
Yes, media can reduce the discomfort of a dysregulating environment that is too intense, like a crowded house, or conversely too boring, a lack of stimulation. Media use can allow for self-soothing and anxiety reduction by providing a highly structured, predictable sensory stream.
So if the screens are helping the child feel composed,
It should be treated as a valid regulatory tool, not just wasted entertainment time.
but relying on it exclusively creates a trap.
It does. It's very difficult to reduce screen time if a child relies on media solely for sensory regulation and lacks alternatives. To reduce conflict, parents have to work with their children individually to construct and design non-screen options at home or in nature adjusted for their sensory triggers.
Like what?
It might involve setting up a Jedi meditation space with a weighted blanket, using noise-canceling headphones, or building a sensory bin based on a Minecraft theme. This ensures screens aren't the sole or primary way they can return their bodies to a state of regulated calm.
And finally, we have to remember that intention matters in our assessment.
The intention has to be clear. Is this tool being used solely for therapeutic dimensions? For example, a child with a language processing disability learning to read via closed captioning while watching science videos.
Or a child with echolalia watching the same show repeatedly to develop verbal communication.
Right, or is it simply being used to keep the child occupied without any co-viewing or therapeutic goal? Focusing solely on therapeutic intention minimizes problematic overuse and provides a defensible boundary.
Okay, let's pull all these concepts into a simple, actionable framework. Let's use 3 conditions: regulation, cognition, and social interests, and decide when to allow, guide, or limit pause.
Sounds good.
Starting with regulation and comfort, when do we allow?
We allow media use when it is clearly serving as a self-soothing or composure tool in a dysregulating environment. The child is overwhelmed, and the predictable input of their chosen show brings them back down. This is recognizing media as a vital sensory tool.
And how do we guide?
We guide by leveraging digital capabilities that align with their strengths, using closed captioning or text, for example, which filters noisy audiovisual input and helps foster focus and concentration, aligning with that visual learning preference in ASD.
And when do we limit or pause media for regulation, even if they're craving it?
If the content is fast-paced, leading to lower executive function, or showing clear signs of agitation and attentional problems, for example, they're bouncing off the walls immediately after the show ends, or having trouble shifting focus, It's time to pause.
That's the red flag.
It's a definitive red flag indicating the media is overwhelming their system.
Next, let's look at the cognitive and executive function EF dimension, that traffic control system.
We allow when the child is consciously utilizing the hero identity, the Batman or Jedi persona, to persevere on a boring or tedious task. When they're triggering that Batman effect to gain psychological distance, that is functional, productive use of the interest.
And how do we guide cognitively?
We guide by using the media interest to teach concepts visually, like creating a video model of a skill, or, crucially, encouraging structured offline expression. Things like writing a story or drawing the superhero in a sequential narrative, which builds planning and organizational EF skills.
And how does a parent determine if hyperfocus crosses the line into limiting pausing territory here?
It must be limited if consumption transitions into problematic media use, or hyperfocus to the extent that the child begins to neglect essential homeostatic functions like skipping meals, fighting bedtime, or refusing to interact with others to continue consuming the content.
That's when it's a real dependency.
That's when the statistically engineered lure of the content overrides healthy homeostatic control, signaling a dependency we have to address.
Finally, the social and emotional aspect. When is the media interest a net positive for social development?
We allow when that special interest, whether it's Star Wars lore or superhero comics, is actively being used as a foundation to build friendships and shared group interests. When it's fostering social affiliation,
It's their entry point.
it provides a safe, knowledgeable entry point into social interaction. We guide through co-viewing and explicitly discussing the moral domain and pro-social behaviors of the heroes. See how Captain America helped that friend who was hurt? We also use the play to practice essential social skills, like turn-taking, compromise, and following rules in group games.
And the crucial limit pause criteria for social behavior. It's tied to aggression and boundary awareness.
Right. If the content consistently leads to the imitation of negative or aggressive behaviors towards peers that are not clearly distinguished as pretend, or if the child shows agitation or dysregulation linked to social conflict around that media, it must be limited. The inability to interpret social cues or the experience of conflict, which again happens up to 4 times more frequently for high-sensory curators, often occurs in these high-stakes play scenarios.
So adult intervention and contextualization are paramount.
They're paramount to teaching them how to manage those social boundaries.
This deep dive has, I think, fundamentally shifted the conversation. We've moved away from the simplistic notion that violence is bad to the far more nuanced reality that processing complex, fast-paced input is the challenge.
At the heart of it.
The data clearly shows that those fantastical heroes can be incredibly powerful tools for emotional mastery, for task persistence, for forging social bonds, especially for neurodivergent boys trying to navigate a neurotypical world. So what does this all mean when we put the screens down and they still have their lightsabers in hand?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most durable answer to regulating media use might be found not in the screen, but in the physical, messy world we share. We know the lasting protection against media's negative effects lies in strengthening the parent-child relationship, the memory of parental signals, the looks, the tone, the effect infused with emotion and low-latency interaction. These are the very precursors of symbolic thought and empathy. They set the entire stage for healthy emotional and symbolic development.
And that critical information flow, that high bandwidth relational connection, is precisely what digital media compromises.
Because it is low-latency, statistically engineered data.
Exactly. We know that digital environments often violate the brain's hardwired expectations about signal timing and format, and that excessive time spent looking at screens decreases time spent looking at faces.
But what's the antidote? High-resolution, low-latency, multi-sensory interaction. Shared meals, shared R&T play, reciprocated touch. That is predicted to be the best way for families to bond and heal. So given this, how can we intentionally reintroduce really physical and social interactions inspired by their favorite heroic narratives?
So it's not about banning the lightsaber.
Maybe the answer isn't banning the lightsaber, but taking the lightsaber battles to a forest for rich sensory input. Or playing a cooperative board game as Jedi Masters to practice turn-taking and impulse control. The ultimate goal is to move the deep affinity for heroism from the low-bandwidth screen back into the high-bandwidth, messy reality of shared physical space.